So welcome everybody to our podcast series, Archetypal Wisdom, the Shakespeare perspective. And today we're talking with Phyllida Hancock. Phyllida is a workshop designer and facilitator focusing on leadership, communication, and organizational development. She worked as an actor and singer for 15 years in theater and on television, including 2 years with the Royal Shakespeare Company. And in 1998, she began working mainly in the public sector, designing and delivering workshops, initially using role play and forum theatre. She then moved to the UK government Future Focus at DTI facility from 1999 to 2010, facilitating conversations with policymakers on scenario planning, performance management, business planning, and project working with departments and their stakeholders across business and government. Phyllida is a senior program director of Olivier Mythodrama, as am I, and works with several other consultancies, including contributing to the Aurora program for women in higher education. So welcome, Phyllida. Great to talk with you today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
And today we are going to talk about the wisdom in Shakespeare's play As You Like It, and in particular how that might be offering leadership lessons, leadership insights to the leaders of today. And in particular, I think it might be interesting to start with the kind of broad trajectory of the play. I mean, it starts in a court. There's a lot of power over kind of masculine archetypal leadership principles, we might say. A lot of it takes place, so the rest of the play actually takes place in the forest, where people get banished or leave to enter the forest, where there's a much more emergent, fluid, we might say feminine leadership or creative possibilities. And then it comes back towards the end of the play with the possibility of a synthesis of masculine and feminine principles of leadership. And I wonder if you could start by maybe reflecting a bit about how you see leadership in the play, how you see masculine and feminine leadership. What does it mean? Is it a helpful term? To unpack that a little bit for us.
Right, not much then. There's some context for this, which I find quite interesting, which is that, as you probably know, when Shakespeare's writing, the dramatists of his era, which was the first time that, it was really the beginning of an age where theatres were permanent buildings and theatre companies were permanent companies. And the culture of the time didn't allow women to appear on stage. So women's parts were always played by men, which limited to some extent the number of women characters that we see in the play. Shakespeare's often criticised for not writing enough parts for women. I think I'd let him off the hook a little bit on that, partly because he did write some fantastic parts for women. But when this play was written, there was a plague in London, and the boys who usually played the women's parts had been evacuated from the city. And this play was written at the end of this year when the plague was coming to an end and people were coming back in. So he didn't have much scope to write the women's parts, but the women's parts that he did write were very interesting. And one of them spends most of the play dressed as a man. And that is a fantastic metaphor for leadership in this age, not just for women. I mean, a lot of women will recognize the idea, there is often a perception that women in leadership behave like men or dress up like men. And I often say, I've met lots of women in leadership, most of whom are themselves, but sometimes I meet women who are behaving like men. So I think it applies to men as well. I think this idea of masculine, feminine leadership is tricky because we have ideas of how those things are in the world and they're not always correct. So I'd want to kind of preface by saying that I think there are certain qualities of leadership that are needed in the world that have to do with creating the atmosphere, creating the conditions where people can come and be themselves, where people feel they can speak freely, where people feel they are trusted and appreciated. Leadership that creates the conditions where people can come and do their best work. They want to come to work. They feel connected to a sense of purpose. I think that all of those things are what makes a good leader, in my opinion. And the companies and the organizations and the schools and the universities and the places where people come together to do work that are run like that are mostly run by men, because that's the way the world works. So these qualities of leadership show up in the best leaders, whether they are men or women. Our challenge, I think, at the moment is encouraging women to see themselves in that space. It's very interesting when Rosalind first has the idea of dressing up like a man, and the idea is that she has to do this in order to be safe in the world outside the court. She dresses up like a man, and she says, I'll have a bear spear and a something else. She says, I will what's the quote? She says, I will put on a man's costume as many other mannish cowards do that do outface it with their semblances. So there's something around the idea that even men dress up like warriors in order to feel brave and courageous. So it's true for all of us that there are certain situations that we go into that we dress up in a certain way in order to meet that, not really knowing what it is we're going into. So that was a very long
No, but it's good, and I like it, and I think it's also maybe important that we distinguish between male and female and masculine and feminine principles of leadership, because as you say, there may be many men who also have a lot of kind of what we might call feminine leadership, like relational qualities, vulnerability, the capacity to create safe spaces for emergence, which we might say are more feminine principles, but they might also be located in men. And equally, there are women who have a lot of masculine drive or masculine kind of power trips sometimes, or kind of masculine ways of moving in the world. So I think it's important we distinguish between the genetic makeup and the masculine and feminine principles of leadership also.
And of course, there's a lot of commentary at the moment on the countries that have done well, have met the coronavirus well, and many of them are being led by women, which is nice. And a lot of those women have had to take really tough decisions. It's just that somehow we're in a state where we have to accept those tough decisions. You know, one of the things that dismays me when I listen to people talking about women in leadership, including women, is I had a woman boss once and she was a real bitch. And you just think, well, they can't all be. They really can't. So what is it we are seeing? What is this bias that leads all of us to look at somebody taking tough decisions that don't suit me and think, oh, I don't want to be like that. So anyway, it's kind of another conversation, but it is in this play, but I want to broaden it out and say that there's a lot in this play. This play, more than any other, I think, is a bold statement, it deals with ambiguity. When Shakespeare was writing, a lot of his plays, not all of them, but a lot of his plays were performed at the Globe Theatre, as we know, and other theatres like it, which have the audience pretty much all around, which means that you can't have much in the way of scenery because it blocks the view. So there's never anything on the stage, or would have been very little on the stage, that would have told the audience where they are. And there are some plays that really flit around. I mean, Antony and Cleopatra goes all over the place, and there's very short scenes and you never know where you are. So until somebody says, here in the court we do this, or here in the forest, you don't know where you are. And as you said, this play has two locations: the court, which is very traditional, very patriarchal, very hierarchical, very highly structured, the kind of the way we do things, and the forest, which is a dangerous place. We know that there is at least one lion and one snake. And a place where the seasons really are, when we first go to the forest, it's winter, and it's a really, really, really harsh environment. But on the stage, they would have looked exactly the same. Not only that, there are lots of characters in this play, and there would have been a small company of actors who would have played more than one part. And again, the only way of distinguishing the different characters would have been by a hat or a sash or something else. Not very little to distinguish. Not only that, so already we've got, the scene may change on the stage and you don't know whether you're in the same place you've just been or whether you're somewhere completely different. You also don't know whether the characters on the stage are the same characters that were just in the scene you saw, or the same actors playing different characters. So confusing. You also have three instances where there are characters that have the same name as another character. So there are two characters in the play called Jaques. There are two characters in the play called Oliver. There are two dukes, which are often played by the same actor. So a lot of confusion, a lot of, is this ringing any bells? So it's like, there's a lot of ambiguity and the play is called As You Like It. It's kind of, Shakespeare also saying, it's not up to me. You take what you want from this play. So, and that is the way the world is. We have a lot of choice and a lot of bias about how we see the world. So that also speaks to me I can see you're bursting to say
Yeah,
something.
because I'm wondering, because I love how you're framing that, and then I'm wondering, what does it teach us about ambiguity? I mean, it shows us a lot of ambiguity. Does it also give us any lessons or point us in any directions in leadership as to how we embrace ambiguity?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's something here about attention, paying attention. In the court, which has become a place of tyranny, is ruled by a capricious, powerful duke. The language is very clear. People know exactly where they are and exactly who they're meant to be. It's pretty clear. If you watch a production of this play, you would, unless it was a weird one, you would probably be very clear about the pecking order. You would know by looking at the people on the stage, the way they carry themselves, the clothes they're wearing, what the order of importance is. In the forest, so the people who live, people who don't know the place so well, this court, this tyrannical court, is a dangerous place. It's ruled by somebody who is very capricious, humorous. He's described as being humorous at one point, where things are decided by violence, arguments are met with violence, and money is the most important thing. Money much more higher up than love, on friendship, family relationships. We see two sets of brothers who are at war with each other. We see women are marginalized, and we also see that truth is not a welcome visitor. The person who tells the truth is out of a job in this place. Nevertheless, however bad things get at the court, however unpleasant they are, nobody leaves unless they're forced to, unless they're banished, well, except for one person. But because they're so frightened of the world outside. What we hear from the people who are threatened with banishment is that the world outside the court is a dangerous place, where there are people with swords, there are robbers, there are rapists. It's frightening. So the people who go out into that world tool up to meet it. They have weapons and they take with them various resources. They end up in the forest, as I've said, in the winter, where there is people, in order to survive, you have to work together. You have to.
I just want to pause you for a minute, because this is very much where we are now, right?
Yeah.
In a way, we could say metaphorically, as a society or as a culture, we've been banished from the court, from the way that we know how to do things, even if we didn't really like it very much. We've now been banished. We're now in the forest, where everything is a bit strange and unfamiliar. We're needing to kind of band together. So just to kind of make the link as you give us a synopsis of the story, that's kind of where we are now, right? We're in the forest.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the questions I ask people when we're doing this program is, when we get to the bit where people leave the court and go to the forest, I ask people to think about what resources you to meet the unknown. If you are either forced, as we are being, to go into the unknown, or if you choose to go into the unknown, or if your life changes in such a way that you can't avoid it, what resources would you put in your backpack to take with you? Because what we see in the play is people take weapons, they take money, which is the currency of the world they live in, and they also, both of them, have friends, company, people that they love or who love them. So it's quite an interesting question to say, how well are we resourced to meet this unknown? And of course, with the best will in the world, the resources that suit us in our old world may not suit us in the new world. What happens in the play is that one group of people arrive, and the money they brought with them is of use, because they meet someone who can sell them a house. So they buy a house and they set up home, and it's kind of easy for them. The other people who arrive in the forest with exactly the same resource, including quite a big chunk of money, don't meet anyone who can sell them a house. So it does them no good at all. And the character, Orlando, is forced to go and find food for his friend who is dying. So he goes into the forest and he finds a group of people who are sitting down to lunch, and he behaves in the way that's expected of him in his world, which he rushes in with his sword, he threatens them, and he says, if you don't give me what I want, I will kill you. And the Duke, who's in the forest, the head of this community, meets this violence with gentleness. He says to him, I can see you're distressed. He says, your gentleness shall force, more than your force, move us to gentleness. You're welcome. And Orlando says, speak you so gently. I thought that all things had been savage here, and therefore put I on the countenance of stern commandment. I assumed that coming into this place, it would be full of savages and danger. And that's why I put on this face, this appearance of stern commandment, of bullishness, you know, and he puts down his sword. So there's really something here. There's a big challenge to all of us about how do we, understandably kind of tooled up to meet a frightening time and a place of uncertainty, which we know is very disturbing. How can we, as leaders and as people being led, open up, you know, take off this armor, put down this sword that has been so useful to us in our past, that has made us who we are and given us strength and power, reputation, all of that. How can we put that aside and say, I'm willing to share with you in order that we all survive? And I may not get everything that I want, but I trust that I will get everything that I need.
Right, and he's able to do it because he's also met, as you say, the Duke meets him with generosity of spirit.
Yeah.
Right, and I think one of the questions that I sit with at the moment is experiencing a lot more kind of generosity of spirit, like people applauding for the NHS workers and people kind of looking out for colleagues who might be vulnerable or neighbors who might need something, and people going to the shops for each other. I mean, there's a lot more community and connectivity at the moment. And I carry a question sometimes about whether there's really a shift in our consciousness, so that when this period is over, whatever over might mean, there's actually a new level of connectivity and relationship, or whether we're just going to revert to type as soon as we can. And I don't know if the play gives us any sense about how these shifts that happen in the forest, like towards the end of the play, as I said at the beginning, there's this marriage of the kind of, or a hint anyway at the marriages that could bring about a synthesis somehow of the best of the old and the best of the new. And I wonder if there's any seeds in there about how we embed these beautiful shifts that happen in the forest into something more long-lasting.
It's such a good question. I mean, I'm conscious I want to be loyal to the play and not put anything in there that's not in there. Well, certainly what happens is there's a process of people meeting each other in different ways. So it's interesting what you say. My experience as well of the lockdown is that I'm desperate to help. trying to find ways. I've signed up to the app and I've done this, that and the other, and I'm in loads of WhatsApp groups and nobody's asking me to help. I've been a group, we're making visors, which is the lowest skilled job that anyone could do, sticking things together, and it's great and it's fine and they're grateful for it, but it's not where I have previously located my value in the world, if I can put it, if that's not too pompous. So there's something, and that speaks to my sense of who I am and my value, my use in the world. And that disturbs me. And also, of course, I'm not being paid for it. So the whole thing about value. So what I would say, this is a very roundabout way of answering your question, but I think it might help. So one of the things that we see happen in the play is when the play, as you said, moves between the court and the forest, but it dovetails. So there are 3 instances where we're in the court, then we get a glimpse of the forest and we get a sense that it's a nicer place to be. And then we're yanked back to the court where it's getting madder. Then we're in the forest again, it's winter and it's horrible and it's dark and cold and everyone's hungry and they've got nowhere to stay. And then we're yanked back to the court again. And then when we finally land in the forest, it's spring and the winter is over. But as part of this winter, we see the Duke speaking to his people, and he says, we don't feel the peril of the court. He says, here, feel we not the penalty of Adam, the season's difference. And he talks about the winter wind. He says, even when it bites and blows upon my body, even till I shrink with cold, he says, I smile and say, this is no flattery. These are counselors that feelingly persuade me what I am. And that is a key point for me. What is it? How do we get to be persuaded feelingly who we are? What are the situations, the conversations, the practices, whatever it is that actually helps me properly feel, not just know, but feel what I am. What am I in the world? So there's something about self-knowledge and self-understanding, which you then hope would be able to resource new skills and new ways of doing things. So there's something there. There's also something, I think, about learning. There's quite a lot in the play about how we learn. Do we learn from going away to school and being taught stuff? Do we learn just by observing and being in tune with what's around us? So the seasons have said a big deal in this play. It always surprises me that the Duke says, oh, we're seeing the seasons now we live in the forest. You think even in the 16th century, the idea that if you lived in a court or in a city, you would be out of touch with nature. I mean, we're certainly been feeling that, but even then there was that sense that, oh, we've lost touch with the cycle of things. And when I work with this play, I often ask people to just think about what are the cycles that you observe in your organization's life? Because there will be cycles. There will be seasons when things are fruitful. There will be seasons when things lie fallow. There'll be seasons when it feels like winter, but we know that the seed is turning and new life will come. So that's a big thing, which is also in the Tempest. But in terms of how we go back, I mean, one of the conversations I had once, we were running this program in Fintorn. Oh, you were ill, actually. I think you went there. You were there for some of it. And one of the contributors said, how would it be if we could find ways of having portals back into the forest? So when we get back to the court, because the question at the end of the play for me is, what happens when they go back? Because we've never seen the lovely, gentle Duke in the forest. We've never seen him in the court. We assume that he was nice there, but we don't know that. So we don't know when all these people go back to where they were before, that they won't revert to type. So what is it that we can take with us from this experience? This spaciousness, this willingness to be of help, of use, even if it is an ego-led thing, which of course, I'm perfectly I recognize that in myself. I want to help other people, so I feel good about myself. I get that, but that's not a bad thing. It's better to do that than not help people in the world. So how can we find this quality of giving of ourselves and not expecting something in return in the workplace? What would that mean? Because we need to be paid. So there's something about value, isn't there? There's something about how we value one another.
Yeah, there's something about value, and I also like what you said about learning, and I think there's also something about habits. Like, what are the new habits that we want to cultivate that can override the old habits? Like you said, we go into the forest, and then we're going to tug back to the court, and I take that as a metaphor that we're going to tug back by our old habits. We experience something new, yeah, but the old habits, they have a gravity. They have a kind of a capacity to keep drawing us back again and again and again. And as you say, there's a hint at the end that there's a possibility of new habits being created, but we don't really know. But I'm also curious, maybe you could speak for a bit about Orlando's journey, because Orlando goes on a journey from like fighting for himself to fighting for a friend to kind of fighting for the other. So he kind of moves, we might say, from being kind of egocentric to kind of ethnocentric to something approaching a kind of world-centric, or a willingness to embrace the other as himself. Like he ends up saving his brother, who he's at loggerheads with at the beginning of the play, from certain death at the hands of the snake and the lion that you referred to earlier. So he's gone on a journey of, we might call it moral awakening, or extending his circles of compassion or care. And maybe that's also the cultivation of a new habit or a new way of engaging with the world that has some seeds of optimism.
Yes, that's so lovely. He is fascinating, Orlando, because just listening to you talk, it makes me think of him in a new way. He does go on a long journey, to use the slightly cliched way in which we talk about ourselves, but he also retains the core of who he was at the beginning. So at the beginning of the play, it's great. Shakespeare, he very often starts his plays right in the middle of a conversation. It's really brilliant. Like, apart from the occasions where he uses a narrator, it just goes, you're way in there and you don't know who these people are. And the whole play begins with Orlando saying, "As I remember me, Adam, it was upon and he's in the middle of telling Adam that his father has died, and his father in his will has left him 100 crowns, I think, 1,000 crowns, and his brother, who's taken over the estate, his elder brother, is refusing to give him his inheritance. And he's really annoyed about it, and he says, the spirit of my father, which I think is within me, begins to mutiny against this servitude. I will no longer endure it. Arrgh! And yet, he says, I have no wise remedy how to avoid it." So he's been denied the thing that matters most in this world, which is money, and he's really angry about it. and he acknowledges that he needs a wise remedy that he hasn't got. And so his brother comes in and they fight, they try and kill each other. That's the way this world works. So we see him first as an angry young man. And the way he tries to get out of the situation is he goes up for, he enters a wrestling competition in which he's almost certainly going to be, if not broken, if not killed, then broken, in order to win the money that he needs to get out of this world. So it's all about money and violence and money and violence. And then he gets a chance to escape because his old servant Adam gives him his money, and he takes his sword and off they go. So that's how he is in the forest. And then he arrives in the forest, and in the meantime, he hasn't even met Rosalind. He's seen this princess and fallen in love with her. He hasn't said a word to her because he's completely tongue-tied. He doesn't know what to do with this new emotion. He can't express himself at all. Anyway, he goes to the forest, and because he meets the Duke, and the Duke says, "You don't need to be like that anymore," he's transformed into this. He's still trying to express himself. All he has to do now is find a way to talk about his feelings, because he's got nothing to fight for anymore. And he writes poetry, and it's terrible poetry, and he sticks it up all over the forest, and people tell him it's terrible, and he doesn't care because he's trying to express himself. And if you read the poetry, you understand. So he's on this journey of discovery, but it doesn't really suit him. He meets Rosalind in disguise, and she tries to teach him how to be a lover and how to see things for what they actually are, not for what his fantasy is of them, which is going to be an interesting one for us, actually letting go of a fantasy of what we think the world is and what we think we need to do. She tries to bring him down to earth and see love for what it is. And in the end, he having swung from one side of being a vicious, fighting, angry man, he swings much too far the other way into this place of being a poet, which he's not. And by the end of the play, he's settled back into this place of a hybrid of being what he was before. So he kills the lion. So he's clearly got some weapon. He uses that bit of him for good. As you said, he uses it to kill something that's about to kill the man who's trying to kill him. He saves his brother's life. So he goes back. He finds an equilibrium between being an extreme version of what he needed to be in the other world and an extreme version of what he could be in the new world. He needs to find that hybrid, and that's what he does. And you could say that Rosalind does the same. She spends most of the play in a man's costume because it suits her, and people pay attention to her and they talk to her and they listen to what she has to say, which never happened in the court. But in order to get what she really wants, which is a marriage with Orlando, she has to, in the end, show the world who she really is. And that's an interesting question for leaders too. Where are the moments where you have to say, it's not necessarily about being vulnerable, but it is about being honest about who you are, because we all put on different costumes all the time. All the time we are saying, in this meeting, I'm going to be the chief executive. In this meeting, I'm going to be your friendly colleague. In this meeting, I'm going to be the innovator. I'm going to come up with lots of ideas. In this meeting, I'm going to say no. So we people do step in and out of all those different archetypal behaviors. And if you're not careful, you can get lost in them. So what does it mean to be the person that I really am? And that goes back to one of the key pieces in this play, which is very well known, which is the speech that Jaques gives. Jaques is a character who is a melancholy philosopher. He's not very cheerful. He says at one point, I can suck melancholy out of a song as a weasel sucks eggs. It's a bit miserable. But he has met, in the forest, he has met the jester from the court who's escaped to the forest, who's very funny. Well, in Shakespeare's day it was funny. He's not so funny now, but he is quite funny. And Jaques sees this way of speaking the truth. The jester's role was to speak the truth in such a way that people in power would be prepared to listen, which usually comes with a dollop of humour. If you can be funny enough, the people who want to hear feedback will hear it. So the jester is doing his shtick, and Jaques meets him in the forest and thinks it's hilarious. He says, I laughed for a whole hour. By my watch, I laughed for a whole hour. And then he says to the Duke, I want to do that. I want to be the person who speaks the truth like that. And the Duke says, well, I'm not sure it's really your thing. I don't think you can do that. And Jaques says, give me leave to speak my mind, and I will through and through cleanse the foul body of the infected world if they will patiently receive my medicine. I just think, who's going to listen to you? So he has this real urge to speak the truth, and he sees the worst in people. But when he sees Orlando talking about this old man that he wants to, whose life he is trying to save, he reflects on that. The Duke says to him, you see, we're not the only ones in trouble here. The Duke says, the wide and universal theatre presents more pageants than the ones we play in. And Jaques responds by saying, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. Now, we've heard that a lot. Most people who live in this country are familiar with that. And it's surprising that he does it that way around. You'd expect him to say, they have their entrances and their exits. If you're talking about actors on the stage, they come on, they go off again. But no, he reverses it. They have their exits and their entrances, which makes me think that, well, the way we use it in the program is this idea that all through our lives, we play different parts at different phases of your working life and of your other life, if you have another life, is that we step into different roles. We either because they're what we are at our best, or because it's what we need to be, or it's what we're being forced to be for whatever reason. We come onto the stage as these different characters, and that's a fascinating conversation to be having right now. What are the roles that I've played? What have I learned from them? The famous speech about the 7 ages of man is very sweet. It's very, he looks back on all the ages of a person's life, and they're sort of ridiculous, but they're also, he has compassion for them all. So what have we learned? What have we put aside? And in this next phase, what is it I'm going to need to be when I come onto the stage as a leader in the new world? What will I be? Who will I be?
Yeah, that's lovely. And I think, as you've also said, and what remains constant, like you've also said, like Orlando kind of flourishes or flows from kind of one extreme to another, and then there's something kind of core in his being, and there's something core in Jaques' being. So what are the roles that we take on that really suit us and are embedded in us because they're part of our core intelligence, you might say, and what are ones that we kind of try on for a while, or we kind of overdo for a bit, but we kind of make a fist of it. I'm also curious, maybe we can close with a bit of reflection about culture, because I'm also very interested in two aspects of culture that I see in the play. So one is, as you said, that often we have the same actors playing slightly different characters, as if to say, like the Duke is sometimes played, the kind of vengeful Duke in the court is sometimes played by the same actor who plays the kind of benign Duke in the forest, as if to say, well, it may not be us that changes so much, but the culture that we're in might elicit different behaviors from us. And similarly, when we see towards the end of the play, we see the vengeful Duke kind of coming into the forest, bent on revenge. He meets a holy man, has an encounter that we never really know so much about at the edge of the forest, and comes in transformed. Like something's happened with this encounter with a holy man. That means he now comes in the spirit of restitution and honoring the people who he's banished and giving them back their inheritance. And I often see the holy man as the kind of guardian of the culture. He's saying there's something in the forest here that you need to pay attention to. And as the Duke kind of enters this different culture in the forest, the vengeful Duke becomes transformed. And I'm curious about the impact of culture on behavior. So there's leadership, there's kind of what do I do and how do I hone my art? And then there's the culture around me that is having an impact on me 24/7, whether I'm aware of it or I'm not. So I think part of the responsibility of leaders is to also create a culture that supports innovation, vulnerability, transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if you could just reflect maybe towards the end of this podcast on how culture plays out in the play for you.
I do agree with that. And we've often used this play as the starter for a conversation about culture change. It's an interesting one because I think leading culture change is quite a tricky thing to do, because it requires, what happens in the forest, as far as we know, what happens in the forest is that they all come together because they can only survive when they work together. And what's lovely about the play, it's done a lot, this play, and it's hard to do well because really it's just a lot of talking. But what it is a lot of relationships. So what we see quite a lot in well, at least 2 occasions in the play where characters meet in the forest and they don't really get along, but that's okay. In fact, one pair, Jaques and Orlando meet, and Jaques is saying to Orlando, well, you write this ridiculous poetry, please stop, it's awful. And Orlando says, I don't care what you think. And at the end they say, oh, I don't really like you. No, I don't really like you. Let's meet as little as we can. But they shake hands and part. It's a sort of, it's a recognition that we can't always be surrounded by people that we get on with, and that difference is a challenge sometimes. So there's that. So something about the culture being formed by the very people who are there, and it's like mixing something into porridge, or it's mixing in lots of different ingredients so that you can see they don't become one cloggy mess. They become, it's a terrible metaphor, but something about difference coming together and staying different within the same container. And the leader's role is to invite those people in, as we were saying before, invite people in who are different and let them be seen and let them be heard, and create the space for them to be who they are and have a voice. That's one of the huge things, how leaders allow voices, the unheard voices, to come through. And the other thing is that leaders also have to deal with the culture that they're in. So one of the things that I was, just to finish with a story, I was running this program, the bit of the story that you spoke about, where the bad duke comes to the forest with an army and meets a holy man and is converted. That all happens off stage. What happens is a character we've never met before comes on and says, oh, we thought you'd like to know that the Duke is on his way to kill you, but he met a holy man who's been converted, so you can all go home and you can all have your money back. And it all happens like that. And it's ridiculous and it's hilarious and it's a bit of Shakespearean jiggery-pokery to kind of time to finish the play. And I've always thought, well, I'll leave that bit out because it's so silly. Anyway, I was running a program for a whole lot of people who came together, who were involved in the climate change movement. A lot of the people involved in Paris, and they were having a few days together to try to work out how they can work together better, because, as you know, there's lots of disagreement about how to meet the climate crisis. So, and they said, will you come and tell this story just to kick us off? So I told, it's 9 o'clock at night and they'd all had a long day, and I told the story of the play, and I got to the bit and I said, there's this ridiculous bit in the play where someone comes on and says the Duke has met a holy man. And there was just a gasp in the room and a bit of laughter. And I stopped and I said, about 200 people there. And I said, what's going on? Why? And they said, that's exactly where we are. We are trying to persuade the bad dukes of the world to change what they're doing to save the planet. And we're not managing it. So suddenly this ridiculous bit of the play became very meaningful for them. And then there's a conversation about, instead of trying to create the world that we want, we also need to be in the world that we're in, and we need to meet people where they are. We need to meet the people we're trying to convert or the people we're trying to persuade where they are, not where we want them to be. So that seems to me a really key thing, that the willingness to meet people, to go beyond halfway, actually, to go towards the people with the sword, as the Duke does, and find this balance between the force that we need to get stuff done and the force of a purpose and of wanting to be the best and for drive for forward momentum, which is a good thing, to balance that with the gentleness of slowing things down, of civility, of good manners, of well-meaning benevolence. We need both those things. We need a drive and a force and an urgency, but we also need this, and that's what this play talks about, the balance between those two things.
Yeah, beautiful. What a great story, a great example. I always think that encounter with the holy man is actually very critical. I always play it up quite a lot when I work with the story, because I think it leads us into a conversation that we've just been having about culture, which I think is really fascinating. Because I think the other responsibility of leaders is also to embody the culture that they want to see. So we want to make space for the voices, we want to meet the other people, and we want to embody the culture that we're espousing. Maybe we could close. I'd love you to close with a little speech again. And I wonder if you could close also, because you just mentioned the climate emergency. There's this beautiful speech in Act 2 where Duke Senior talks about, seeing good in everything and the sermons in stones, and just to bring kind of nature and the environment present and how it can be when we really sink into the beauty of the environment around us and the nature around us. Could you?
Yes, I'm gonna read it because I don't know the whole thing off by heart. So yeah.
Wonderful.
Now, my co-mates and brothers in exile, hath not old custom made this life more sweet, more free from peril than the envious court? Here feel we not the penalty of Adam, the season's difference, as the icy fang and churlish chiding of the winter's wind, which when it bites and blows upon my body, even till I shrink with cold, I smile and say, this is no flattery. These are counsellors that feelingly persuade me what I am. Sweet are the uses of adversity, and this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything.
Yeah.
And what I like about that, and it comes back later in the play, actually, this idea that all the different ways of learning. So he talks about tongues. So we learn by listening. He talks about books. We learn by reading. He talks about sermons. You know, we learn by listening to wise people. You know, and later on, when Orlando and the Duke first meet, they have this conversation about what they have in common, and they talk about sitting down with friends and eating. They talk about going to church, so finding a kind of spiritual connection, and this idea of gentleness, of nobility, the things that connect us underneath everything else. We are connected by our humanity. So there's something about how we can allow space for that, even while the world is moving, because the world never stops. You know, we spring, winter's followed by spring, followed by summer, followed by autumn and winter again. So we keep moving. It's not about finding a place to stop. It's a kind of a temporary resolution where we can find the space to learn some useful stuff.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. It's been great to share this space with you, reflecting on the teachings of As You Like It. And I really love this closing speech or it's not a closing in the play, but closing our podcast, because it also speaks about sweet other uses of adversity. And we are in a time of adversity, and maybe there's also a sweetness in it that we can learn new things and be new people and offer new possibility at this time as well. Thanks, Phyllida. It was great to share this time with you.
Thanks for letting me ramble on.